The world today faces economic, social, and political issues on a global scale. But who makes the choices and how we handle them? What is global governance? And what is the role of the United Nations in global governance? To know more, we invite you to continue watching this video for a wider perspective of world politics.
According to the contemporary debate on world politics, global governance is everywhere. It is either an observable phenomena such as an NGO's worldwide campaign against corruption, political visions that are expressed in a call for a more powerful international legal system, or the ubiquitous talk about global governance itself. Almost any process or structure of politics beyond the state, regardless of scope, content, or context, has within the last few years been declared as part of the general idea of global governance. What this idea is about, a question rarely addressed. Instead, most of the works on global governance stop short of pondering why they are using the newly coined term rather than the more old-fashioned terms such as international organization or international politics, and what is implied by its use. On the other hand, for those who ask, what is global governance, are likely to jump into conclusions that global governance appears to be virtually anything. After the publication of Governing Without Government in 1992, global governance in 1995 became a conceptual debate for the way ahead. We argue that the concept of global governance can help us make sense of interactions and transformations we observe in world politics, and only if it is used in a better way. The argument unfolds in three steps. Firstly, we contend that concepts are the most basic research tools social science has at its disposal. The core function of concepts lies in ordering and structuring our observations and experiences in order to make general propositions. Secondly, we apply this argument to our analysis of the way the term global governance has been used in literature. We define them between two general uses of the concept: global governance as a set of observable phenomena, and global governance as a political program. Lastly, after analyzing the different uses of the concept, we develop suggestions for future research that adopts a global governance perspective. Defining governance this way merely mirrors the breadth of government as we commonly understand it. The definition is no broader than international agenda and is already in the era of interdependence and disintegrating boundaries between national and international arenas. It deserves underlining also that the definition does not limit governance to the reaching of decision about rules. The term, however, has often been used that way. The predominant definition of regimes to cite an important example is rule-oriented, although it also encompasses principles, norms, and decision-making procedures. Accepting the meaning of global governance automatically disposes of the argument that it is either synonymous with regimes or closely related or identified with them. The term governance has been applied to international matters in a variety of ways that have been at best disorderly and perhaps confusing.
The United Nations was founded in the year 1945 after the Second World War. The said organization officially started with 51 countries with a goal to achieve and maintain peace and security for those included in the said organization. The name United Nations was coined by former United States President Mr. Franklin D. Roosevelt. But how exactly was the United Nations formed? What were the important events that led to its inauguration? On August 9 to 12 of 1941, both President Franklin D. Roosevelt of the United States and Prime Minister Herchel of Great Britain boarded the same naval ship Talosig. They were both headed in a meeting regarding the World War. It was the first time that the two leaders had met as heads of their respective governments. The document that had resulted from the Roosevelt-Churchill meeting was issued on August 14, 1941, and became known as the Atlantic Charter. This document was not a treaty. It stated that the two leaders namely tried to make known certain common principles in the national policies of their respective countries, on which they based their hopes for a better future for the world. On January 1, 1942, at a meeting in representative of 26 countries, which are the following: the United States, Great Britain, Soviet Union, China, Australia, Belgium, Canada, Costa Costa Rica, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Greece, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, India, Luxembourg, Netherlands, New Zealand, Nicaragua, Norway, Panama, Poland, South Africa, and Yugoslavia. The mentioned countries signed a declaration by United Nations in which they pledged their support for the Atlantic Charter's principles. According to history under Article the Atlantic Charter, both the countries, the United States of America and Great Britain, established a common principles, which are the following. First, their countries seek no aggrandizement, territorial or other. Second, they desire to see no territorial changes that do not accord with the freely expressed wishes of the peoples concerned. Third, they respect the rights of all people to choose the form of government under which they live in, and they wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. Fourth, they will endeavor with due respect for their existing obligations to further the enjoyment by all states, great or small, victor or vanquished, of access on equal terms to the trade and to the raw materials of the world which are needed in the economic prosperity. Fifth, they desire to bring out the fullest collaboration between all nations in the economic field with the object of securing for all improved labor standards, economic advancement, and the social security. Sixth, after the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny, they hope to see established a peace which will afford to all nations the means of dwelling in safety within their own boundaries, and which will afford assurance to all the men in all lands may live out their lives in freedom from fear and war. 7. Such a peace should enable all men to traverse through the high seas, oceans, without hindrance. And lastly, they believe that all the nations of the world, for realistic as well as spiritual reasons, must come to the abandonment of the use of force, since no future peace can be maintained if land, sea, or air armaments continue to be employed by the nation, which threaten or may threaten aggression outside of their frontiers. They believe pending the establishment of a wider and permanent system of general security that the disarmament of such nation is essential. They will likewise aid and encourage all other practicable measures which will enlighten peace-loving people the crushing burden of armaments. On April 25, 1945, the United Nations Conference on International Organization was held in San Francisco with 50 nations represented. The next day, on June 26, it was already signed. The Charter, which consisted the preamble in 19 chapters, divided into 111 articles, called for the United Nations to maintain international peace and security, and also to promote the expansion of human rights. The Charter also specified the principal organs of the United Nations, which will then be tackled soon. On October 24, 1945, the United Nations had already have the 5 permanent members of the Security Councils, together with the majority of other signatories. Did you know that the United Nations' first ever General Assembly took place in London in the year 1946 of January 10, with a total of 51 nations represented? Exactly 4 years after the Charter went into effect, the cornerstone was laid for the present United Nations headquarters, which is at New York City, United States of America. Since 1945, the Nobel Peace Prize has been awarded more than 10 times to the United Nations and its organizations or to individual United Nations officials.
Over the years, the role of the United Nations expanded from an organization that focused on peace and security. It provides solutions for problems related to environment, healthcare, refugee dilemmas, criminal justice, and more. There are 5 main purposes of the UN. First is to maintain international peace and security. Following the devastation of the Second World War, UN is focused on one central mission, the maintenance of international peace and security. The UN does this by working to prevent conflict, helping parties to make peace, peacekeeping, and creating conditions to allow peace. These activities often overlap and should reinforce one another to be effective. The UN Secretary Council has the primary responsibility for international peace and security. Second is to develop friendly relations among nations based on equal rights and self-determinations of people and to take other appropriate measures to strengthen peace. Developing friendly relations among nations help us to work together to improve the lives of poor people, to conquer hunger, disease, illiteracy, and to encourage respect for each other's rights and freedoms. Third is to achieve cooperation in solving international economic, social, cultural, and humanitarian problems. Cooperations among nations will benefit the entire nations. Countries that experience similar economic, social, and cultural problems can solve this by working jointly. This is also an effective tool to strengthen the relationship with one another and to achieve their common goals. Fourth is to promote and encourage respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction to race, religion, sex, or language. Protection of human rights is a key purpose and guiding principle of the United Nations. In 1948, the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights brought human rights into the realm of international law. Since then, the organization has become diligently protecting human rights through legal instruments and on-the-ground activities. It is significant because it allows all people to live with dignity, freedom, justice, equality, and peace. The fifth or the last purpose of the United Nations is to be the center for harmonizing the actions of nations in achieving these ends. United Nations aims to be the center in maintaining unity among nations. They have created the Sustainable Development Goals, which purpose is to produce a set of goals that meet the urgent environmental, social, political challenges facing our world. All 17 goals interconnect, meaning success of one affects success of others, and that development must balance social, economic, and environmental sustainability. It is designed to bring the world to several life-changing zeros, including zero poverty, hunger, AIDS, and discrimination against women and girls. These 5 main purposes of the United Nations involves us all to build a more sustainable, safer, more prosperous planet for all humanity.
The basic principles of United Nations. According to Chapter 1, Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, the organization and its members, in pursuit of the purposes stated in Article 1, shall act in accordance with these following principles. Number 1. The organization is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all its members. Number 2. All members, in order to ensure to all of them the rights and benefits resulting from membership, shall fulfill in good faith the obligations assumed by them in accordance with the present charter. Number 3. All members shall settle their international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered. Number 4. All members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. Number 5. All members shall give the United Nations every assistance in any action it takes in accordance with the present charter, and shall refrain from giving assistance to any state against which the United Nations is taking preventive or enforcement action. Number 6. The organization shall ensure that states which are not members of the United Nations act in accordance with these principles so far as may be necessary for the maintenance of international peace and security. And lastly, nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state or shall require the members to submit each matters to settlement under the present charter, but this principle shall not prejudice the application of enforcement measures under Chapter 7.
What are the organs of the United Nations? The United Nations has 6 main organs. It is the General Assembly, Security Council, Economic and Social Council, Trusteeship Council, International Court of Justice, and the Secretariat. So let us talk about the General Assembly first. So what is the General Assembly? The General Assembly consists of 193 member states of the United Nations. It is the deliberative assembly of all members of the United Nations. What is the role of the General Assembly? The role of the General Assembly is to resolve, discuss, debate, recommend things as subjects that pertains to peace, security, development, and international issues of all states that is under the United Nations. But the General Assembly does not have the power to enforce the resolutions discussed in the Assembly. They are also tasked to approve new members by a proposal from the Security Council. They also elect the non-members of the Security Council, all members of the UN Economic and Social Council, and the Trusteeship Council. They also participate in the election of the 15 judges of the International Court of Justice and the selection of the Secretary General. What are some noteworthy Assembly actions of the General Assembly? These are Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Uniting for Peace Resolution, Millennium Declaration, and Zionism is Racism Resolution. So let us now talk about the Security Council. So what is the Security Council? The UN Security Council consists of 15 members, which 5 of them are permanent members who has veto powers and 10 of them are non-permanent members. They also have 1 each vote and are obliged to comply with the decisions of the Council. What is the role of the Security Council? The role of the Security Council is primarily for maintaining peace and security. They take the lead of determining a threat to the peace of all nations and sometimes required to make compulsory decisions. The Security Council also rotates and changes its presidency every month. The work of the Council is facilitated by Military Staff Committee, Sanctions Committee, Peacekeeping Committee, and International Tribunals Committee. So now let us talk about Economic and Social Council. So what is Economic and Social Council? Each council consists of 54 members that are each selected by the General Assembly, which will serve for 3 years. So what is the role of Economic and Social Council? The role of the Economic and Social Council is to coordinate and promote cooperations as regards to the economic, social affairs, and the cultural activities of the UN by their specialized agencies. They also have consultative status to non-governmental organizations. The 3 categories of the consultative status are General Category NGOs of Category 1 that includes organizations with multiple goals and activities. The second category is a Special Category NGOs or Category 2 that is specialized in certain areas of the ECOSOC. And the third category is Roster NGOs or Category 3 that only focus on the regional interests of the UN activities. They are all enabled to attend ECOSOC meetings and issue reports and testify at meetings.
Trusteeship Council. The Trusteeship Council suspended operation on November 1, 1994, in the independence of Palau. The last remaining United Nations Trust Territory on October 1, 1994, by a resolution adopted on May 25, 1994, the Council amended its rules of procedure to draft obligation to meet annually and agreed to meet as occasion required by its decision or the decision of the President. Trusteeship Council supervises and administers trust territories. These are usually territories of non-self-governing people who are voluntarily placed themselves under the control of the United Nations. International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice, commonly known as the World Court, is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. It was established in 1945 by the Charter of the United Nations and began work in 1946. The seat of the court is at the Peace Palace in The Hague. Out of the 6 principal organs of the United Nations, it is the only one not located in New York. The court's role is to settle, under the international law, legal disputes submitted to it by states, and to give advisory opinions on legal questions referred to it by authorized United Nations organs and specialized agencies. The court is composed of 15 judges, who are elected of terms of office of 9 years by the United Nations General Assembly and the Security Council. Secretariat, an international staff working in duty stations around the world, carries out the diverse day-to-day work of the organization. It services the other principal organs of the United Nations and administers the program and policies laid down by them. Its head is the Secretary General, who is appointed by the General Assembly on the recommendation of the Security Council for a 5-year renewable term. The duties carried out by the Secretariat as varied as the problem dealt with by the United Nations. These range from administering peacekeeping operations to mediating international disputes, to surveying economic and social trends and problems, to preparing on human rights and sustainable development.
The challenge to the United Nations. How can it be an effective channel to attain lasting peace and security in the world? One of the first challenges of United Nations is institutional changes. First and foremost, this is about the United Nations Security Council reform. There are 15 members and 5 of them are permanent. Many people say we have moved on since the Second World War. The world is a different place, and this Security Council, particularly the questions of the veto by permanent members of the Security Council in any decisions, needs to be addressed. How to address that is another matter, but there are those who argue that it needs to change. The democratization of the UN process, which is the transfer of power from the Security Council to the General Assembly. The institutional structure of the United Nations must reflect on some of the new approaches that are necessary to deal with these problems. Second, the UN Secretariat Transparency and Democracy Reform, which consists of the presidential election of the UN Secretary General, the election of the members of the General Assembly, and the election of the members of the International Court of Justice. Now, you might say that that's a very simple thing to do, and it's not that simple because the country has interests, and when you go to the United Nations, you need to express your interest, and what might be in others' interest might not necessarily be in your interest. So in terms of changing in the structures of the United Nations, this is not simple in the fact that there is no common agreement. Even if there might be common agreement as regards changes, there is no common agreement as to what these changes are. But the fact that there are many countries around the world who think that it must be institutional changes in the United Nations. There is a key challenge to all of us today, the question of protecting the environment. As I speak to you, 90 more million tons of earth-warming substances would have gone up to the sky, making climate change worse. As I speak to you, the species are disappearing in an alarming rate. Indeed, the estimate is that every 1 hour more than 4 species disappear from this planet, never to return due to urbanization, deforestation, and climate change. As we speak, the glaciers are melting at the fastest ever rate before we could go on as regards these environmental changes. I know that in some regions of the world, storms and droughts have intensified and they have become more frequent. The oceans are 30% more acidic than they were 150 years ago and warmer than it was 100 years ago. This particular challenge has a lot of consequences: poverty, migration, refugees, wars, and health or hunger. This is a major challenge, and the United Nations is where all the nations, generally speaking, meet 193 of them to discuss all the issues that affect us both as individual nations and as a globe. Therefore, it is the responsibility of the United Nations to try and tackle some of these environmental challenges. There is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, United Nations Convention on the Compact Desertification, Convention by Biological Diversity, Ramsar Treaty, and others. All aimed at trying to help protect the environment, and this protection of the environment must be the responsibility of all of us, and there is no better place for us to do this together than at the United Nations. So, here is a question of human rights, and when we say human rights,
It's not just about people being able to march on the street and shout and do what they want to do or say what they want to say. It's also about the basic thing that having enough to eat. There are so many poor people in this world today. To have a proper education, a proper home, because all of that is human rights. Proper and decent life, proper decent salary, and so on and so forth. And the United Nations, as I said, it's where 193 nations come together, and these questions are questions that most of these nations are concerned with. Ordinary people suffer the consequences when they lack these rights. Therefore, it is the United Nations' duty, responsibility to help in solving this particular challenge. There is a major question of peace and security. Since World War II in 1945 ended, we have had more than 200 major conflicts in this world, and more than 60 million people have died. Conflicts are still going on and innocent people are dying, and this is because the question of peace and security still needs to be addressed in a more fundamental way. To give some facts about this challenge, 200 wars have occurred since 1945. 60 million people have died. No region of the world was spared. Presently, numerous wars or conflicts taken place in every region at every country level. Where they are not fighting at home, war is conducted by proxy. We spend 2,000 billion annually on arms, and over 65 million people around the world have been displaced. There are many more challenges. There are the rights of women and children, and so on and so forth, that need to be dealt with. There are the huge amount of environmental challenges, apart from those that I have mentioned here, which needs to be addressed. The protection of the forest and things like that. How do we stop mining our land because more and more land is being integrated, and we could go on the environmental health of people. The United Nations, as the body where everybody comes together, need to work on this. We all have to play a role, and in particular, young people, because we are the ones who will lead these nations in the future. So we need to be able to handle all of these questions. You and I, all of us in this planet, have a role to play. At the end of the day, the issue is, how can you make an input to make the organization work better for you?
So, to summarize, global governance is virtually anything and it is everywhere. Any process or structure of politics that is beyond the state, regardless of the scope, content, or context declared within the last few years, is a part of the idea of global governance. A great example under the idea of global governance is the United Nations. This is actually derived from the Atlantic Charter's principles, which was a result from the meetings of President Theodore Roosevelt and Prime Minister Herchel from Great Britain regarding the World War II. Later on, 26 countries would sign the declaration by United Nations, which was derived from the Atlantic Charter's principles. The UN's purpose was to maintain international peace, security, including the rights of its citizens. It was made to address economic, social, cultural, and humanitarian issues in hopes of solving them with the cooperation of its members. All of its members are required to uphold the principles, which is in accordance to the purpose of the United Nations. Some of these include foreign equality of all its members, rights and benefits resulting from its membership, and settling international disputes by peaceful terms. The United Nations has principal organs such as the Trusteeship Council, which supervises non-governing territories under the United Nations. Another is the International Court of Justice. This settles legal disputes under international law. The Secretariat is an international staff that is all around the world. So, what are the challenges faced by the United Nations? There are some institutional changes needed in the organization, like Security Council reform, Secretariat transparency and democracy reform. But the major or key challenge needed is the environment. Why? Well, the environment actually causes a lot of long-term effects for us, such as poverty, migration, refugees, war, and health or hunger. there's also one more challenge that is tackled by the United Nations, and this is human rights. Human rights does not limit to one's right to life, but it also applies to a proper education, a proper home, a decent life, and a proper salary, and many more. The United Nations also cares for women and children rights. So, now that we've tackled global governance, what do you think? Is it good or is it bad?